Good morning, everyone, and thanks, Sue. To kick off the wellhead protection webinars, I guess I'd just like to welcome everybody for participating in them. And I'm just there's a couple slides here that I want to go through just to kind of get started. We're just trying to get started here. Please bear with me. All right, there we go. We got that little technical difficulty out of the way right at the start. Well, again, welcome everybody. And what I wanted to do was just point out that this is the first of 4 webinars. The one today is general overview of the wellhead planning process, and we're going to have 3 subsequent webinars. And again, Beth and I'll be referring to these a little bit during the presentation today. I wanted to let you know that all the webinars are being recorded, and at a later date, if you want to go back and listen to one of the webinars again or see one of the webinars again, there will be a voiceover, and you'll be able to see the PowerPoint and hear the presenters that are presenting for each of the webinars at the Rural Water website. So please take note of that if you want to go back and listen to these in the future. The other thing, kind of to get started this morning, and I just wanted to refer everybody to, there was a best practices for attending the wellhead protection webinars using WebEx that was sent to you back on February 20th, and that has information about screen sizing and directions for using the WebEx chat. So if you have questions, I'd encourage you to look at that February 20th email to answer some of those basic questions. If you run into technical difficulties with WebEx this morning or the webinar, please send us a chat, use your chat feature, and we've got people standing by that'll try to kind of help answer some of those technical questions. Also, I'd like to point out that webinar questions can be submitted during the session via WebEx chat, and we're going to be trying to answer the questions during the webinar, and probably we'll answer most of the questions at the end of the webinar. Finally, the materials for each webinar are available at the Rural Water website. And if you go to the MRW or www.mrwa.com, there is now a link on their homepage on the right-hand side, and that'll take you directly to the materials that we're using for today's webinar. And there's also some general supporting information that's been put out on the Rural Water website too. With that, I'd like to introduce Beth Cluthy. She's one of the planning supervisors for the Source Water Protection Unit, and she's going to get us started this morning with our wellhead planning processes overview. Beth?
Thanks, Mark. And I'd also like to welcome everybody to today's webinar and express our appreciation for you being willing to take time out of your busy days to learn about wellhead protection. And just as important as learning about the plans themselves, we're really going to focus on why the process is so important today. So I want to start a little bit by setting that stage, and I hope will help you understand why MDH is hosting these webinars. Our objective is to not only promote good plans, but also good planning, because that will meet the mutual goal that we have, both of getting meaningful wellhead protection plans approved and implemented by public water suppliers in order to protect our drinking water supplies. So the webinars will not only focus on the nuts and bolts of what is in a wellhead protection plan, what goes into that document, but also, just as importantly, on how the planning process itself can be beneficial in developing and implementing effective protection of drinking water. So a good planning process focuses on communications and methods that lead to successful plan development and implementation. And oftentimes, I think you will hear Mark and I stress this throughout today, it goes back to good communication and good connection with our local resource partners and our public water suppliers. In the webinar series, we intend to focus on the issues that the consultant community told us was their highest priorities. That's how we determined the 4 topics, and so we hope that we are meeting your needs. We look forward to a strong, mutually beneficial relationship with the consultant communities, because in many ways we have the same clients, the public water suppliers. So we hope that this will, again, strengthen our relationship with you through improved communication and information. We do want you to feel free to submit your questions throughout this webinar, as well as comments and suggestions that you might have for us. If we don't have time to answer all of your questions today, we do intend to compile those and provide answers, and those would be sent to all of the webinar participants at a point in the near future. So I thought you might like to see some faces that go with the voices. As Mark alluded to, he and I are planning program supervisors in the Source Water Protection Unit. I will be talking a little bit about the context and background, including some of the program history and the legal basis for wellhead protection, and touch on how Part 1 plans influence Part 2 plans. Mark will then talk with you about what goes into a Part 2 plan, building better plans, sharing tips for effective planning, stressing the importance of good communication, which will all result in an approved plan for the public water supply system that protects public health. And I will wrap up by highlighting some of the recent changes to the Wellhead program here in Minnesota, and hopefully provide you with some technical assistance tools that you'll find helpful. Wellhead protection is not a new concept. It's been around a while, and it dates from some of the earliest times in our history. There's been a long-standing recognition that protecting drinking water from potential sources of contamination is just an important and basic step that communities need to take. If we fast forward to 2015, we have maybe a little more bureaucratic definition of wellhead protection, but the fundamental goal remains the same. We want to prevent contaminants that can adversely affect human health from entering public water supply wells and the aquifer supplying water to those wells. So you'll see the emphasis here is on effective management in order to reduce risk. And at its heart, wellhead protection is a proactive program. It's about trying to identify and prevent problems before they occur. Wellhead protection plans are the vehicle we use to accomplish that goal in Minnesota, or I should say one of the vehicles we use. And a wellhead protection plan, key elements are identifying the area that needs protection so that we all have a common understanding of the area that contributes drinking water to that community. It also involves identifying and listing what those potential contaminant threats and other risks in that area are, and then it will contain the strategies that a public water supplier is going to implement to effectively manage those potential contaminants to reduce risk. Good wellhead planning can result in effective protection and prevention is the key message. Again, very briefly, to provide some of that background and context, I wanted to review for you the legal basis for wellhead protection. It all stems from 1986 amendments to the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, which of course is the national law that provides oversight for drinking water programs across the country. And those 1986 amendments required states to develop wellhead protection programs. In Minnesota, the legislature further enhanced and clarified that by passing the Minnesota Groundwater Act of 1989, which in part required the Minnesota Department of Health to develop a wellhead protection program for the state. And the Health Department has been appointed the primacy agency for that program here in Minnesota. This led to the final document referenced on this slide, and that is the Wellhead Protection Rule, which was adopted in 1997. It lays out the requirements that public water suppliers must meet for wellhead protection activities in Minnesota, and in essence, it makes wellhead protection mandatory in some regard for every single public water supply system in the state. As part of those requirements is this requirement for some of our public water suppliers to develop and implement wellhead protection plans. So if that previous slide gave us the legal basis for wellhead protection, I really think it's more important that we focus on why this is important to do. So the real why behind why we do wellhead protection planning. Like most prevention efforts, it is more effective and cost efficient to do protection and prevention versus cleanup or restoration. In the early days of the program, the Health Department conducted a study, showed 26 different public water supply systems across the state had expended in excess of $44 million to address contamination. So certainly the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure comes to mind. Clean and safe drinking water is needed for economic prosperity. Contaminated wells do affect every corner of a community. In the small rural community that I live in northern Minnesota, we had a contamination event in the early 1990s. And it was prior to my working at the Health Department. But what I remember most about that contamination event is that it reached into almost every corner of the community. Schools were closed down because of the uncertainty of the drinking water supply and the inability to prepare food. Our hospital had to initiate their emergency preparedness procedures and put into service a backup well, which was especially important to me because just coincidentally I had a small child in that hospital at the time. Businesses were disrupted. Some did send employees home. Others had posting signs. Grocery stores cleaned out all of their produce because of those little sprinkler systems that had been spraying that water on top of the fresh produce. And so it truly affected almost every aspect of the community in the surrounding area and disrupted the community for several weeks. And protecting, maintaining, and improving the health of all Minnesotans is the Minnesota Department of Health's mission, and certainly wellhead protection is a program that speaks to that core mission and value we have as the public health agency in the state. And then finally, the people that live in the state of Minnesota put a high value on safe drinking water. In fact, research has shown that citizens cite safe drinking water as the #1 reason why they voted to tax themselves in the 2008 Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment constitutional amendment question. And so that in itself is a pretty rare event where citizens have chosen to voluntarily tax themselves, but we have demonstrated here in Minnesota that safe, clean drinking water is that high of a priority for us. I'm going to transition now from some of this more general background to talking about the planning process for Part 1, wellhead protection plans. And so we're transitioning from some more general information into kind of the specifics of Minnesota's wellhead protection program. The very first step in a planning process or project is for the Health Department to notify the public water supplier of the need to develop a wellhead protection plan. We call that phasing here at the Health Department. Public health risk is the primary criteria. that MDH uses to prioritize new planning projects. Right now, our concentration is on vulnerable municipal public water supply systems with a goal that all those systems will have plans that will be approved by 2020. Secondly, all remaining non-vulnerable municipal public water supply plans will have started wellhead protection planning by the year 2020 and be somewhere along the road to having a final plan approved and then implemented by the year 2020. The good news is that you are not alone out there, that there is assistance to help with a planning project. Minnesota Department of Health has a very close relationship with the Minnesota Rural Water Association, and staff in these two organizations can help with a planning project. A technical assistance planner is assigned to every planning process at the beginning of a planning process. We do everything we can to keep the same person on the project through plan development. That's to ensure that we have good consistency and good communication. And I am trying to get at a couple of maps that were available on the Minnesota Rural Water website to show you. This is a map showing the state of Minnesota that MDH, we've divided the state into 7 geographic areas, and Planner and Hydros work as a team across these areas. And you will see here names and contact information. You can think of these people as resources for if you have questions about plan content, what goes into a wellhead protection plan. Perhaps you have questions about the planning process and working with a wellhead protection team. These folks can help you with those as well. Plan procedures sometimes can be complicated, and at a minimum, they're really bureaucratic for most of us. These people are experts on knowing what a public water supplier has to do when, and also on how to get a plan approved. What are some of the submittal tips? So again, this is a person who can answer those questions for you. There is also staff at the Minnesota Rural Water Association. Again, we work very closely with these folks. They have access to some of the same tools and information that the health department planners have. This is a map showing how Rural Water Association has divided the state into 4 areas. Again, there are names and contact information for each of these people. And so the key message is don't hesitate to call at any time during a wellhead planning process. These folks are resources for you, and we want you to feel free to avail yourselves of them. The Scoping 1 meeting is the official start of a planning process, and we regard that as the formal kickoff for a wellhead protection plan. And the purpose of that meeting is to scope the content of a Part 1 wellhead plan. So that, at this point in the planning process, is where the emphasis is, the primary pieces of a Part 1 wellhead plan. We don't intend to talk in great detail about Part 1 plans. These webinars are intended to focus primarily on Part 2 wellhead plans. And so our conversation regarding Part 1s are really going to be limited to how do they fit into the overall planning process, and also how Part 1 plans influence Part 2 plans. And that influence, I think, is best described if we look at the fact that the protection area itself is determined during the Part 1 planning process, where we delineate wellhead protection areas and drinking water supply management areas. That is the geographic focus for the Part 2 wellhead protection plan, and that's the focus for our public water supplier systems to focus their protection efforts and implement management strategies. Another important piece of the Part 1 plan, of course, is the vulnerability assessment. That is also directly related to how our public water suppliers will manage those areas. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about Part 1 in the next segment of the webinar, but really the intent today was to focus on Part 2 wellhead plans. So at this point, I'm just going to pause to see if we've had any questions submitted, but there are no questions at this time. Again, feel free to submit those at any time throughout the webinar. We're really interested in hearing from you. With that, I'm going to turn the next segment over to Mark.
Thanks, Beth. This next section is going to focus more on the planning process and really the importance of the planning process in developing successful plans. And in this particular slide, again, I'd like just to emphasize that good planning and following the process is really what I view as part of the keys to success of wellhead protection. And again, I think Beth mentioned the word communication earlier, and I think spending time working with our resource partners is really critical to the development of good plans and working through a wellhead team to protect drinking water and ultimately protect public health. So again, I want to talk a little bit about the planning process and what, from our perspective, what are the keys to a good planning process that help protect drinking water and public health. Beth mentioned that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Part 1 plan, but it's really important, as all of you know, when we start working on the second part of the plan, we really need to reflect back to the science that's included in that Part 1 plan, because one of the strengths of our program, again, as you all know, it's science-based, and we need to be reflecting on, again, what's the DWSMA map and what is the vulnerability of the particular system that public water supplier that we're working with. Are there any well vulnerability issues? Are there well construction issues that are a concern and we should be taking into account as we move into that second part of the plan? Were there any contaminant issues? Nitrate, some of our public water suppliers may have nitrate issues, and there could be other contaminant issues also identified that we need to be really thinking about as we embark on starting that second part of the plan. Also, any future data collection or monitoring needs, those things are included in the Part 1 plan, and we need to keep those in mind as we move forward as well. So again, this is really the science piece of the wellhead planning process, and we're taking this information and we're moving it forward, and we're applying that science in that local planning document that we refer to as the Part 2 wellhead plan.
No, stop.
Again, all of you, I'm sure, are quite familiar with the maps, but I just wanted to point out a DWSMA map, and there's just some key things on it that we all need to keep in mind on the map. In this particular example with Cook happens to be moderate vulnerability, and the vulnerability is noted on the bottom right-hand side of the map. If it's moderate vulnerability, we're going to focus mainly on wells and tanks. So we're taking the vulnerability that's in the Part 1 plan, and we're relating that and applying that to what do we focus on in the second part of the plan. The other components of the map are, we've got our DWSMA boundary. What is the geographic area that we're focusing management strategies within? Then we got the blue line, which is the delineated wellhead protection area. That's the result of modeling and your 10-year time of travel. And then we've got our inner zone, or the inner zone, or 1-year time of travel, which is the red line in the center of the map that shows that immediate 1-year time of travel area, and really a high priority that we want to focus on for management, being it's so close to the wells. As we move ahead into the second part of the plan, these are the main items that are going to be in that second part of the plan, and all these items you know are also described in the scoping notice that the Health Department puts together and that describes what's included in the Part 2 plan. And again, I don't want to go into great detail here this morning on the Part 2 plan components, but we just need to keep in mind and think about how do these different processes or components fit into the overall planning process for developing that second part of the plan. And the first one here is the data elements and assessments, and those are really the information, maps, data that we use to guide the development of that second part of the plan, and that we need to focus on to protect the public water supply well and aquifer. And again, our data elements are going to be based on our vulnerability, and that's going to be described largely in the scoping notice. What are those main data elements that we need to be considering? Impact of changes on the public water supply wells. Again, those really build on the data elements, and they look at expected changes in regards to water use, land use, water quantity, quality. What are those things that may impact the public water supply well and aquifer that we need to be identifying in that second part of the plan to help the public water supplier address the issues they need to as they move into management strategies. And the third bullet here is issues, problems, and opportunities. Not all public water supplier or wellhead protection areas are the same, so we need to work with that public water supplier and local team to talk about what are some of their local issues and opportunities that may be there for them to protect their water supply. So we need to go more into the weeds when we work with individual communities and wellhead teams to discuss that and figure out what those particular things are. The next item is objectives and plan action. And what I'd like to point out here is that our plan of action really needs to be based on all the preceding items, data elements and assessments, changes to the public water supply wells and aquifers, issues, problems, and opportunities, and the wellhead goals. In fact, I skipped over goals. That's really an important part of the Part 2 plan. And what I'd point out on the goals part is the geology and the vulnerability and water quality having us focus more on protection, or are there water quality or contaminant issues that need to be factored into goals? And that's one of the big things that I see and consultants and planners need to consider when we look at goals. Evaluation program, that's part of the rule, and that takes a look at how effective the plan is in protecting drinking water, and it's something that we require that the community complete every 2.5 years as to is the plan doing what it needs to do to protect public health and the drinking water supply. The final component in Part 2 is the alternate water supply contingency strategy. And again, that relates to if there's a disruption in the water supply, how does the community handle it? What's the local resources available to provide water to the community? And also, who are the players that need to help get that done as far as providing alternate water to the community? And it also identifies who are the priority water users that should be provided water first. If we have a school or a nursing home, to me that would be examples of prioritizing and wanting to provide water to that population in your community first. Well, and putting this slide together, or part of the presentation together, I really start thinking that the wellhead plan is really like putting a motor together. A good plan. I want to just mention too that if you don't have your phone muted, please mute your phone, because I think there's some phones that aren't muted. Thank you. But what I wanted to say here was that the components that I just described are really the parts of the engine, and you can't develop or run a motor without having all the parts. So again, the same analogy is really can be made here. You need all the parts. You need to identify the data elements and contaminant threats relative to vulnerability. You need to really identify the local issues of potential changes that may be anticipated or need to be addressed over the 10-year life of the plan. Have you thought about that, and is that reflected? Do the goals and objectives of the plan reflect the condition, issues, and concerns important and relevant to the water supply? We can't use the one-size-fits-all approach for wellhead planning. We really need to identify the particulars to that community and make the plan work for that particular water supply that you're working with. So, including all the parts should result in a plan that protects the drinking water source and water supply. And the question is, does my engine run? And hopefully all you can see this, but I've got it so that the engine runs, the pistons and things are running in my motor. So you got to make these fun. The next part is we need to follow a map, and that's really a key to how do we do the planning process effectively, I guess is how I would say it, and what are the tools that we use to make that process effective. And some of the things we use, I mentioned to it, the health department issues a scoping 2 notice, and that's really part of that roadmap that lays out what are the components that need to be included in that Part 2 plan. What are the priority issues as it relates to the geology, the vulnerability? Do we have any water quality issues? Those are all included and really identified in that scoping notice. The other thing is the planning issue summary form. That's something new that we've started attaching and including with the scoping notice, and that it also tries to help address some of those unique issues such as old municipal well issues, other things that we may have noticed as we've been working on the Part 1 plan, and we try to highlight those for the public water supplier and the consultant. So I'd encourage you to take a look at those as another planning tool to help you build a better Part 2 plan. The PCSI requirements, those are listed. What are the PCSI items that need to be addressed relative to the vulnerability? The next thing is the pre-PCSI meeting. Again, it's another process and opportunity that consultants and planners really need to take advantage of and try to coordinate and attend those, because those are key meetings that help lay out some of the important PCSI, potential contaminant source issues that need to be addressed in the plan, and you can get into the weeds as far as how complex it is to get that done and what it may take and who may need to be involved in that. The other thing at this point, as you're starting to develop the Part 2 plan, is thinking about, planning for sufficient wellhead team meetings. Is the geology low vulnerable and it's only going to take you 2, 3, 4 meetings to develop the plan, or is it more complex where it's going to need 4, 5, 6 meetings to maybe talk through some of the issues that are threats to the public water supply, wells, and aquifers? So you need to start thinking about what are the particular issues that relate to that public water supplier to get the job done.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt Mark here and let you all know that we are having a technical glitch with the chat feature of WebEx. And as a workaround, we're inviting you to please send your questions to myself. So my name is Beth Cluthy. The email will be Beth, B-E-T-H, .Cluthy, K-L-U-T-H-E, @state.mn.us. We apologize and hope that you will take the time to send in any questions you have so that we can get them answered for you. Sorry about that, Mark.
Not a problem. As Beth was saying, please send in your comments or questions. We'd be happy to try to answer them for you. Back to the roadmap and wrapping up this slide. I guess I just want to say that planning needs and meetings are largely driven by vulnerability, and you need to be thinking about that when it comes to, again, thinking about how many team meetings that you need to take input and involve the people that need to be involved in the wellhead planning process. I've added some wellhead tips here. I think some of these tips probably have already shined through or came across, but again, we really like to emphasize that you contact the technical assistance planner, and that might be rural water planner or the health department planner, the lead planner that's responsible for helping to develop that plan, to discuss any questions regarding the PCSI and wellhead team meetings you might need to complete the Part 2 plan. So there are local experts, and I just highly encourage the consultant community and people and planners working on plans to take advantage of that, take advantage of their expertise to help you through the planning process and answer questions. Well, again, I had to add a little humor. Maybe this is more for me than you, but again, involving the locals and wellhead teams. I mean, hopefully we get the right people involved in the process, but I want you to think about who are the right people to have on the wellhead team. And I think that's really a key to success of the Part 2 plans, is having the right people at the wellhead team meetings that you can engage to develop an effective local plan. And some of those, the right people, are probably your water operator, your city clerk, your city planner. I think we really need to work maybe harder at involving our local city planner that can help address some land use issues in some of our communities. So that's something I'd point out. The mayor, the council, again, getting local buy-in and getting the mayor or some of those local officials involved, understanding what wellhead is, why it's important, is really, really important, I think, for the Part 2 plans to succeed and drive a good implementation process that protects the aquifer and wellhead area. The other thing I'd point out is local knowledge is important. If you don't have the locals there, it's hard to find out what the local issues are and what can be done to locally address their issues and make it their plan. So I can't overemphasize the importance of having that local input and local knowledge and holding those wellhead team meetings to discuss the issues, because I really believe they provide a benefit and help us develop better plans through the planning process. Who else can help? There's a lot of other partners out there depending on the issues. County Planning and Zoning, the Soil and Water Conservation District, and Minnesota Department of Ag if you have ag issues, County Water Planner, all these different state, federal, and local resource partners can help develop better plans, and I think it's good to have them at the table earlier during plan development than call them later after the plan's done and say, oh, by the way, we have a agricultural related issue we'd like your help to address. I think it's much easier to get them involved in the planning process, get their ideas and input, include them in the plan, so that when you call them later on, they're already aware of it, the door is open, and you can effectively address some of those issues. Another thing I'd like to just point out is that I think spending some time with the wellhead planning process makes some economic sense. I've seen situations where they haven't maybe been involved, or we've not had a lot of wellhead team meetings, and we've lost some real important information that needs to be considered or included in the wellhead plan. So I like to think that having a few meetings and following a fairly well thought out process makes economic sense as well, and it helps avoid missing or incomplete information, allows for review and confirmation of data and maps, reduces the likelihood of plan completion delays and disapprovals, and we all have a vested interest in avoiding some of those things, so involving that team and in that way I think is real beneficial. And again, the public water supplier ends up with a more effective and complete wellhead plan. A couple other tips, I mentioned it earlier, but again, as you're working through the planning process, again, link back with your MRWA or MDH planner to help us answer questions or review parts of the plan as you develop it. And another tip is keep in mind that scoping 2 decision notice and make sure that you're looking back at that to make sure that you have all the components in the plan that need to be when you get down to that final stretch of submitting the plan to the health department. Building better Part 2 plans, things to consider. And these are, again, just some helpful, I like to say, tips. Is the plan clearly written, and so the public water supply can understand and successfully implement it? It has to be done in a manner that they understand it, and they can carry it forward, because it's something that they need to work with for 8 years. So having well-written plans is really, really important. And do management strategies reflect the capabilities and resources of the public water supply? I think that's really important too. It has to be written in a manner that they can carry things out, not necessarily what we may think would work, but it has to be what works for them. And again, as I talked earlier, we're the right people involved is really important. Final steps. We're getting to the point that the plan has been put together. You've built in some good process. These final process steps are things, again, to keep in mind that you're working towards. One is the PCSI endorsed, is having the PCSI endorsed by the health department. You want to get that to us early so we can take a look at it, and the rural water and the MRW and MDH planner take a look at that in the draft plan. So we want to be looking at these things as we're finishing up to make sure that we have our ducks in a row and the plan's going to be successfully approved. The wellhead plan submitted for 60-day local government review, and then the public hearing, and then we get to the final step of the plan being submitted to the health department. So again, these are all final steps, things to be thinking about and that you'll be working towards as you submit the plan to the health department for final approval. Again, we'd encourage and think that good coordination and communication is part of developing a real successful plan. And when we follow and I think incorporate some of these planning tools and processes, we're going to have a more effective Part 2 plan, and it's going to be one that there's local buy-in and they're able to implement the activities that will help them protect their water supply and public health in their community. So that's what I have to share with you on the planning process, and now I'd like to turn it back over to Beth to finish the remaining parts of the webinar this morning. Beth?
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to encourage you again, if you do have questions, comments, suggestions, please feel free to send an email. Again, that email address was beth.cluthy@state.mn.us. And the name is spelled, on an earlier slide in the PowerPoint too, if you need to reference it. So please, we encourage you to submit any questions you may have. As Mark said, we're going to transition here from talking about plans to discussing some of the changes that we have seen in Minnesota's Wellhead Protection Program. And I think I would characterize one of the biggest changes we have seen as a shift from an emphasis on plan development and planning to implementation. And plans do, of course, need to be implemented to meet our goal of protecting drinking water. We might think this goes without saying, but I would hazard a guess that all of us have maybe encountered a plan or two that was written and then just sat on the shelf and gathered dust. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. We don't want to see our wellhead protection plans meet that fate, and substantial implementation starts with good plans, and at the heart of every wellhead protection plan are the management strategies. And in my conversations with public water suppliers over the years, that was my key message to them. Those are the activities, action steps, management strategies, all terms for the same thing. But it's what a public water supplier can and is willing to commit to implement during the 10-year life of that wellhead protection plan. And this is where the rubber hits the road, where drinking water protection happens. So emphasizing management strategies is really key to successful wellhead planning. It's critical that those management strategies be clearly written and concise because of this evolution in our program towards emphasizing implementation. Management strategies, of course, culminate from all of the parts of the Wellhead plan that Mark touched on, all of the data, the information, the issues and the problems and the opportunities that were identified by the planning process. We are encouraging SMART management strategies, and you'll see the acronym on the slides for you as a kind of advocating that they be specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and that they call for a specific time frame for implementation. And one way to think about this is if that public water supplier, the wellhead protection manager, picked up the document in a year or 2 years, could they, by reading that management strategy, understand what they needed to do and when they needed to do it? That's really all the time we have for today on the topic of management strategies. But again, there will be an entire webinar devoted to this topic. It is scheduled for April 2nd. So if you have additional interest in this topic, I'd really encourage you to register for that webinar as well. To support this shift to an emphasis on implementation, the Health Department has created a grants program. This is resources coming to us from the Clean Water Land and Legacy Amendment, and a Source Water Protection Plan implementation grant can be a pretty significant resource to help our public water suppliers implement wellhead protection plans. Good, well-written plans provide a clear pathway to grants. We have awarded over $2.5 million since the year 2010. When I was doing the research for this slide, I was surprised at that number. And so that obviously is a significant amount of dollars, and it's great to see. We do have two types of grants available. The plan implementation grants are targeted directly towards helping public water suppliers implement wellhead protection plans. And so the eligibility is really that they have an approved wellhead protection plan in place and that the project that they are seeking funding for is identified in the plan. The maximum amount of the grants are $10,000, but no cost share is required. So that's a pretty sweet deal for public water supply systems. These, of course, need to be source water protection activities, and we are looking for that basic criteria be met during grant reviews. A second type of grant that's available is what we call a Source Water Protection Competitive Grant. A public water supplier does not need to have an approved wellhead plan in place to be eligible for this kind of a grant, but sometimes an issue either it develops after a plan has been approved or simply wasn't recognized at the time. And when management of a high-risk potential contaminant source is called for, this can be an avenue of resources for the public water supplier. So this might potentially be for a project that was not identified in a plan, but again is a source water protection activity. Again, the maximum amount is $10,000, and in this case, a 50-50 cost share is required. Additional information about our grant program is available at that web link that you see on the slide. That web link is updated for every grant cycle that we have. And coincidentally, Source Water Protection Plan implementation grants are open right now, and applications are going to be accepted through the month of March. Since implementation of wellhead protection plans is a key focus for the Health Department, we have also developed an audit program that looks at wellhead protection plans in terms of gauging the implementation. Well-written plans can help public water suppliers also pass audits. As with most audits, good documentation is a key element. So one take-home message is to during the planning process, when management strategies, action steps are being developed, be thinking about, as a public water supplier completes those actions and implements their plans, how can that be documented? Substantially effective and meaningful implementation of drinking water protection is the goal, and we'd like our public water suppliers to get credit for that hard work that they're doing. Going to shift now and talk very briefly about some resources that we hope you would find beneficial and that are available to help you in wellhead protection planning. One is simply to provide you with a link to the wellhead protection rule that is, of course, a formal document that outlines the requirements for plan content and procedural processes that must be followed for wellhead protection planning. There is information available on the Health Department's website as well about wellhead protection. And then finally, the Minnesota Rural Water website, where you were sent to get resources for today's webinar, has not only the webinar information, but also lots of other general information related to the wellhead program here in Minnesota. And another resource I would like to point out in particular is what we call source water protection education resources. And these are great educational resources such as template fact sheets and brochures that a public water supply system can download and customize with their particular information. And so that has been very helpful to public water suppliers in implementing their wellhead plans. With that, we are at the end of our webinar, and we're going to look one more time to see if any questions have been submitted. And while we're doing that, I am just going to shamelessly plug the other webinars. The one coming up next is next Thursday on March 19th, 11 a.m., and that is an in-depth discussion and review of data elements. That will be followed by a webinar on completing a potential contaminant source inventory. And then finally on April 2nd, that webinar I referred to earlier about developing well-written management strategies. One question we did receive was to talk a little bit about the difference between first-time plans and plan amendments. Many communities now in Minnesota are entering into an amendment and somewhat of a second-generation wellhead protection plan is one way of thinking about it. And there are some, I think, special criteria to keep in mind there. For me, it's important that folks understand that sometimes the time frames are much more constrained in amendments, and that goes back to the language in our wellhead protection rule. We have tried to address that by starting some communities a little earlier, but we are still encountering problems with amendments getting completed on time, and that might be one way that you could assist your clients is by prioritizing those amendments when other projects, won't suffer from that. Also, in a plan amendment, we're really looking for the public water supplier to move forward and beyond the type of management that they did in their first generation plan. And so we would hope that those plans and those amendments will build on the first generation plans. Mark, you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, just one thing I would add that we're offering communities an opportunity to come into the program to amend their plan a year earlier. Beth said that the rule says they have 2 years to complete it, and so knowing that that's an awfully short time with all the review process that's built in, we are asking public water suppliers at year 7 of their plan if they'd like to come in a year earlier and begin that process earlier. So if you have a community that's coming up on needing to have their plan amendment, and that might be something to talk over with your client, that, starting that process year 7 to allow an additional year to complete the updating the delineation if it's needed, and the second part of the plan is a good idea. And
so we, had hoped that you would submit questions in writing, but since we do have some time, if you want to unmute your phones, and we'll give this a try anyway, just try asking your questions verbally. We can try to respond. Any questions?
This is Susan. One question, Mark. You mentioned that based on vulnerability, I think you said that, for a moderately vulnerable DWSMA, basically the PCSI would look at tanks and wells. It's hard to pull that out of the scoping list, and I just wondered if there's any kind of reference for that, or if that's something that'll be dealt with in another webinar.
That's a good question, Sue. Yeah, we are going to talk about the PCSI in a webinar in 2 weeks, so we'll maybe touch a little more on that. But what I will say, and I did generalize and say that moderate vulnerability is mainly wells and tanks, and that tends to be true. But given the moderate geology, there are sometimes additional things, and some of those things we list in that Scoping 2 PCSI checklist that should be considered. So again, sometimes the moderate vulnerability, you have to look a little bit at some of the specifics as it relates to the geology. We do take a little bit more time, I think, on some of those to talk to the hydro that's working on the project and trying to focus in maybe a little bit more on, what are some of the nuances that made that public water supply moderately vulnerable. And again, on that attachment, that summary form, a lot of times I will say that we'll try to add or say maybe spills could possibly be an issue or something that we want to take a closer look at in a moderate vulnerable setting, and I'm just throwing that out as an example.
Exactly.
Stormwater is another one that we considered in moderate beyond wells and tanks. But we try to kind of look at that a little bit more closely, particularly in moderate vulnerable settings. Good question, and thank you for asking that.
Yeah, you're welcome. That is one thing that can be challenging sometimes, is just to pull out exactly which data we should be bringing into the PCSI.
Yeah, and that's something, again, like I stated earlier, is just talking to the planners that are involved with that particular project. I mean, that's something I think you can talk a little bit at that pre-PCSI meeting a little bit more.
Sure.
What are some of the particular issues and concerns in that regard?
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Any more questions out there that you would like to ask, either Beth or I?
Well, again, I'll extend an offer that if a question occurs to you after, by all means, feel free to email me, or if you know one of the other planning staff, send them emails as well, and those will be centralized. And I guess with that, I would like to conclude by again thanking you for taking your time, and we appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Totally.